everyone, and welcome back to another video, and today we're looking at a scenario where the Macedonian Empire came back in 2023. Of course, if you didn't know, this was the Grand Empire of Alexander the Great, one of the best military leaders in all of history. It stretched to what they thought was the end of the world in the Indus River, all the way back to Albania and Macedonia in Europe. It covered areas in Egypt, it covered areas in Mesopotamia, Turkey, the Balkans. It covered areas in the Indian subcontinent. This was a very large empire for its time. And we are going to be looking at how strong it would be in the modern day and if it could expand at all. Let's go ahead and begin by just stating how powerful this empire would be to begin with. It would immediately become one of the most influential states. I would still see it being below Russia and of course below China and the USA, but it would most likely be about on par with India when it comes to global influence, being larger, very, very rich with oil, etc., and being in 3 continents, the most, not excluding outside territories, like how France has lands in North America, South America, Oceania, Africa, etc. Excluding that, they have land in 3 continents. Along with that, they are also by far the most powerful in the region, being the most powerful in the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East. Let's go ahead and begin with them annexing some of their weaker neighbors. In the process of creating this empire, we have given way for many, many weak nations, such as Iraq, who has this little sliver of land, or Jordan, who has a few small pieces and a slight bit of land to the south. Along with that, Israel has lost their entire northern bit and only has a small coastline left. These nations would all immediately fall apart. Along with that, we are also going to be including Bulgaria, as they are far too weak to stop any kind of annexation, having lost their capital and their entire coastline. This wouldn't really be the largest, most insane increase in strength for this nation, but it would still be a definite bonus as they now have more coastal access to the Red Sea and a few more territories, including a longer border with Saudi Arabia. Moving on, they would probably attempt to secure influence over Central Asia, where they would finish annexing Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, as both are now quite incredibly weak. I am not even going to map out that war, as they would pretty much walk in and they would completely give up. This is, once again, not the largest expansion, but they are actually growing their border with the Chinese, which may not be the best thing, as they will not be on the greatest of relations with China. They didn't take away too many Chinese lands, but I still don't think China would like a new superpower on their, not superpower, but a great power on their border, who is at least loosely aligned with the Americans, as they are now the Americans' only chance at securing influence in the Middle East, and possibly even in the Balkans. They would continue their push up into Central Asia by attacking Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Once again, this would not at all be the hardest fight they've ever had to fight. They would easily conquer Turkmenistan, and after conquering most of the important regions of Uzbekistan, both would surrender and be annexed. After that, they would most likely move back to the Middle East, as if you can control the Middle Eastern oil, you will have massive influence in the entire world. You will practically be able to dictate, 20-something% already from the land that they have of the oil in the world. That is a massive bonus. They would also move in to annex the rest of Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey, along with Iran, as these are all also fairly weak nations as they have lost most of their land. From there, they would also annex Albania and Kosovo to secure their influence in the Balkans. None of these wars have been major, but they're still expansions which have secured their control of Anatolia and, once again, the Balkan nations. It has also given them a longer border along the Black Sea, as they can now practically embargo Russia if they're teamed up with Finland, as Finland can cut off the Strait of Finland while they can cut off the Bosporus with ease. Next up, they're going to attempt to cement their control of the Caucasus, taking Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. But at this point, because I want to make this video more interesting than just this new Macedonian state taking over everything, the Russians are going to get involved not against Macedonia, but instead on the same side, fighting the same people, although most definitely not as friends. They're just fighting on the same side, both trying to take over as much land as they can. Macedonia to secure their own influence, and Russia to make sure that Macedonia can never grow enough to rival them for their third place position. The Russians would actually be the first to attack into some separatist regions in Georgia. Meanwhile, the Macedonians would push into southern Georgia, but mainly into Armenia and up the Azerbaijani coastline, hoping to reach the city of Baku first. The Russians would also attempt to steamroll down to the city, but despite Russia's best efforts, Macedonia would be the first to reach the city and capture all of Armenia. From there, the region would be split and jointly occupied as a peace treaty is being drawn up, although not one that will be decided on just yet, as both sides want their own claims and neither side is really looking to compromise. Meanwhile, this Macedonian state is going to start to look to other areas. In Central Asia, there's really not much they can do, as with this weird kind of Russian situation, the Macedonians are going to be unable to capture Kazakhstan because the Russians are going to beat them to it. This is going to cause Macedonia and Russia to have one of the largest borders in the world. It's obviously still not in first, as the Americans and the Canadians have that secured, but still giving them a very large and very complicated border. From there, the Macedonians would move further into the Middle East, hoping that in this complete war against all Arabian nations, besides Yemen, who they will declare war on independently later, that it will lead to them securing their influence, relations with the Americans, and possibly even global superpower status. They quickly begin to push down the Saudi coastline, reaching many of the oil fields and cutting off the Arabian Gulf. They then managed to land in the UAE, capturing the important cities of Dubai and I don't know how to pronounce it, but the UAE's capital. They then pushed down into Oman, capturing the coastline and capitulating the country, leaving only Saudi Arabia. They would swiftly move in and capture Riyadh and start to push down towards the Muslim holy cities. They would manage to capture those as well and meet up in the center, ignoring the desert and simply cutting off Saudi Arabia fully. From there, they would continue this invasion down into Yemen, who would not stand a chance at all. Around this time, though, a new alliance will be formed up as Saudi Arabia gets an ally in Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, and Libya. This is a new, basically anti-Macedonian pact that hopes to kick the Macedonians out of the Islamic world. Sadly for them, Macedonia was preparing for an invasion of Egypt either way and are quickly able to push in even towards the desert. They begin an invasion along the coast, cutting off Sudan and completely capitulating Eritrea, and also starting along the Libyan coast, not managing to capture the capital but many important cities in the east. Egypt has by now completely capitulated as well, as they have little to no important cities. They also begin to push down the Nile into Sudan, hoping to capitulate the nation as soon as possible. Next up to fall will be Yemen, as Saudi Arabia is still fighting a guerrilla war in the deserts, but that is not nearly enough to stop the Macedonians from continuing this invasion. It would slow down, but the main fight is now in Africa. The Macedonians would reach the South Sudanese border, setting up camp. Along with that, together with a naval invasion, they would capture the entire Libyan coast and push down south until Libya too is completely cut off from just about everything. After that, a peace treaty will be reached, and all of these nations are now dead. In this peace treaty, many other North African nations demand that the Macedonians do not annex Libya, and the Macedonians are eventually forced to agree once most of the world, including arguably most importantly, the Chinese, who back this agreement in which they can take much of the coastline, but still not enough to completely ruin these countries for good, except for Egypt, who is completely and utterly destroyed. Along with that, the entirety of Arabia is annexed by the Macedonians, showing no care at all for who lives there or what they want, simply wanting to secure their own influence in the region, and therefore the Macedonians now directly occupy or own the entirety of the Middle East. From here, a new alliance will be set up between the nations who wanted to protect Libya and Sudan, and those are going to include Chad, Niger, Algeria, Tunisia, Mauritania, and technically Western Sahara as well, although that would not be nearly as official. Along with that, soon enough Somalia would join to form up this kind of bloc against the Macedonians. It may not be enough to stop them in the long term, but for now, they are not looking to get into this absolutely massive war against all of North Africa. They instead merely annex what they already had and start to put on as much pressure as they can. This has also secured the resource-rich areas of Arabia, mainly including, as just about everyone knows, oil, especially in the Persian Gulf where there's a lot of natural gases, etc. They now control all of that. The riches of the UAE and Qatar, that is entirely theirs as well. And controlling Israel and Iran, they would most likely have nuclear technology by now, although I am going to assume that nukes for some reason do not exist in this world, as if they did, things would turn out very, very different, as such a young nation would not have enough time to prepare proper anti-nuclear programs, etc., if a war with Russia did break out. Although at this point I don't really think they care much. They control the entirety of the Red Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf, along with a good portion of the Indian Ocean. They would attempt to move up and secure their control of the Balkans, setting up a kind of deal with Croatia to divide up Bosnia and northern Serbia amongst themselves, while they simply invade Romania, take what they want, and leave the rest to crumble. This has, at least to some extent, secured their influence. Along with that, an alliance with a new, far more powerful Croatian state will be beneficial as a buffer between themselves and Central Europe, including Hungary and Austria, who would most likely be defended by the Germans. Along with that, Hungary moves in and annexes what's left of Romania for themselves, hoping to set up some form of state that is strong enough to repel the Macedonians. Although at this point, I think Macedonia would be considered a great power, especially thanks to their oil rights, their massive pieces of land. Would they be the largest country in the world by now? Let us check. If you move them over on top of the US, they are most definitely larger than the mainland US. If you count in Alaska, it would be very, very similar. Same thing with China. It would be very close. They are still smaller than Russia, and most likely also slightly smaller than Canada, but they are still a very, very large country. At this point, they would also stage a conflict with Ukraine. This would normally not be a big deal, but at this point, Russia has continued their expansion even further. We're assuming that the NATO alliance does not exist at all. Thus, Russia has a fairly simple time taking over the Baltic states and Belarus, who at least to some extent is willing to join them. This has secured Russian interests in Eastern Europe and left only Poland to defend before the entirety of the East falls to either Macedonia or the new Russian Empire. In this new conflict, Russia would once again intervene, staging an invasion of eastern Ukraine, capturing many lands, whilst the Macedonians push into the south, capturing the island of, depends on if you count it or not, but the territory of Crimea, which the Russians did not control in this timeline. The Russians would then continue their invasion of northern Ukraine, capturing significantly more land. Although the Macedonians do manage to capture cities like Odessa and territories like Crimea, the Russians secure Kiev and surrounding territories. This is around where the first Great War for Macedonia is going to begin. That war, of course, against Russia. They're by far their largest rival. They swiftly begin an invasion of Central Asia as they capture lands in Kazakhstan that the Russians are just not fit to defend. At this point, the Russian army is still doing fine as they were never thoroughly embarrassed in Ukraine, but they are still not doing as well as you would expect, as that equipment is still not great, and although there isn't Western funding going into Macedonia, they are still at least the more openly supported country. They push into Ukraine, capturing Kiev and the rest of the Black Sea coast. They then begin an invasion along the Russian Black Sea coast, as here they have full naval dominance. The Russians are stuck, and the Macedonians can do as they please. Soon enough, they cut off the Russians completely and make massive gains into southern Russia. They kick the Russians entirely out of the Caucasus Mountain region and capture Dagestan. From there, they continue their invasion of Kazakhstan until most of the territory is under their control. This may look like a lot of land. It's not the most important piece of territory, but it is still very useful, especially after the entirety of southern Russia falls. Ukraine is recaptured, and an invasion to Belarus is started. So far, this has been an absolute disaster for the Russians. The world was seeing Russia expand swiftly into territories while not doing anything for some odd reason, and now the Macedonians are absolutely demolishing them, and I believe that fairly soon the Russians would sue for peace, especially if the Macedonians continue to make the large amount of progress I see them making. In this peace treaty, the official borders of the two states for the foreseeable future will be made. The Russians will be allowed to keep small access to the Black Sea, whilst being forced to give up practically all of Kazakhstan, even lands that were not yet occupied. They would be allowed a very small coastline on the Black Sea, but no Russian ships would be allowed in the region, similar to what happened to the Russians after the Crimean War. The Russians can use it for trade, but to do so they have to pay the Macedonians to get through the straits, and it really wouldn't even be worth it. In the process as well, the Macedonians take over part of southern Ukraine and puppet the rest of the nation. They also create a puppet government out of Belarus to expand their influence up north. From there, they set up the southern Russian state. Once again, another puppet government meant to weaken the Russians and strengthen themselves and their influence in the region. This is technically not entirely under their control, but it is an occupied zone, meaning that their troops are allowed in it and are actually supposed to be in it. It's a fairly harsh treaty, as the Russians were still technically not losing entirely, but in truth, everybody knew that the Russians would lose, and they didn't really have a choice in the matter. If they had not surrendered, they would have been fully killed, and if not, they would have lost many, many more territories in the resulting peace treaty. This would also secure Macedonian control over practically everything they could want: the Middle East, the Balkans, and Central Asia. And the only thing left to do is the final Great War, the Great War of Southern Asia. At this point, India had been seeing this rising threat on their border and expanding themselves. Their economy had grown hugely, nearly doubling in the years since the Macedonian Empire had been created, and their army had also grown substantially whilst military spending had tripled. India had started to make themselves as strong as possible, and they would keep this up. Actually, I'm gonna leave the Russians. No, they are unnecessary now. Russians are still a fairly large threat, but they have been thoroughly embarrassed, and I doubt they will try anything against the Macedonians anymore. The Indians, however, are definitely at least looking for a fight. They have been rapidly expanding their military, and in the time that it took Macedonia to invade and finish off Russia, they have secured Pakistan by invading the weakened nation, along with Afghanistan. Let me show you what that looks like. Not Afghanistan, actually. Afghanistan doesn't exist here, but they did secure Sri Lanka. This isn't a massive expansion, but they turned Pakistan into a sort of puppet state in between them and the Macedonians. Meanwhile, they directly invaded and annexed Nepal and Bhutan, whilst forcing the Bangladeshis into giving up a portion of the north of the country to better connect their regions. This hasn't made them into a massive threat, but this has most definitely made them into a power to be reckoned with. Still not as powerful as China or the Americans, but at this point I would put the Indians in fourth, putting the Macedonians in third. Definitely still a threat. The Indians would continue their expansion into Southeast Asia by securing Myanmar, annexing some of the territory for themselves, whilst puppeting the rest of the country. At this point, this is getting a bit absurd for the Macedonians, as they do not want to have any sort of a powerful threat, etc. on their border, and the Indians have just turned themselves from a potential ally to the largest contender for a future war. And this war will soon break out over Pakistan. The Macedonians are now claiming some of the territory for themselves, and the Indians are just not having it. A border dispute soon starts over some border territories in Kashmir, where they are attempting to claim the entirety of the area, and in Pakistan, where they are simply trying to expand their territory slightly. India, who is completely unwilling to give up these territories at this point, refuses to even think about the option, and soon enough, war will begin. In this war, nobody really knows who the aggressor was. All everyone knows is that the third and fourth most powerful countries in the world are now at war. The Macedonians would have the immediate advantage, at least near the beginning, as they push into southern Pakistan and central Pakistan, whilst also capturing all of Kashmir. They offer the Indians peace, but of course the Indians refuse. So they continue their invasion in the north, capturing at least what's left of the Pakistani country, and pushing down south into some Indian territories. They once again offer peace, this time in which they gain all of Pakistan, and India once again refuses, something they will learn to regret very, very soon, as the Macedonians start a major breakthrough in the south, managing to capture the important city of Mumbai. With that, they managed to capture the entire southern region, and once the central front completely fractures for the Indians, the Pakistani encirclement is completed, and India has now lost an absurd amount of men and resources in a completely pointless war. By now, the Indians are already considering surrendering, but not before the Macedonians near the Indian capital capture the rest of the north and push their advantage after capturing Mumbai in the south, capturing a lot of the region. At this point, the Indians already know they're gonna lose. They cannot win this. Even if the North Africans joined, which they most likely will not, they are not looking for a war, they are merely prepared for it. That would probably still not be enough to destroy this empire that has now grown, and the Indians eventually agree to a compromised peace in which they don't lose an absurd amount of land, but it will still be incredibly embarrassing for the Indian state, possibly leading to a future alliance with Russia and a great war in which the Macedonians would go up against the Indians, the Russians, and the North Africans. Although that is not something that I'm going to be doing right now. Macedonians have gotten just about everything they could want. They have destroyed all of their neighbors except for China, who is arguably still more powerful than them. They have destroyed India, secured their influence in Central Asia and the Middle East. They still haven't secured all of North Africa, but if they really wanted to, it would not be that difficult. Relations with the USA are not great due to this mass expansion, but they are working. The Indians would also be forced to give up a territory which would be under the occupation of the Macedonians. So yeah, not as bad as the Russian peace treaty, but still incredibly embarrassing for the Indians, who had just grown out of the kind of shell that they had been put in since British colonization. With that, though, I am going to end it here. The Macedonians are now the third most powerful country in the world, possibly nearing second or first. They are still not as powerful as the Americans, but they are definitely getting there. I do hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Bye.